Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the March Raleigh Astronomy Club meeting. My name is Mike Keefe, and I'd like to welcome any new members and guests. Feel free to introduce yourself on chat. Um, and obviously welcome to all other members. We would ask that you be respectful and please mute your microphones during the presentation. So a couple of announcements before we get going on tonight's topic of the introduction to electronically assisted astronomy. We have some upcoming events. March 17th, we have our regular monthly imaging meeting. March 25th is our RACOBS, and that's the Raleigh Astronomy Club observing session. That is still at the moment reserved for members only. From March 28th through April 3rd, we have the Staunton River Star Party. That is not a RAC event, but a lot of our members do attend that. In April, we have many events that are related to the statewide Star Party. We'll be talking about that a little later in our business section, so please stay tuned. There are lots of opportunities, not only to attend, but also to volunteer and help share astronomy with the Greater Triangle area. Then on April 8th, which is also the night of many statewide Star Party events, we do have our regular observing session planned. On April 14th, we have our imaging meeting, and April 22nd is our regular club meeting, and the topic has yet to be decided. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with tonight's talk. I am tonight's speaker. So if you could please post your questions in the chat, and I'll ask some of the other leadership team to maybe watch that chat and raise any questions as needed. And with that, we'll get started. Okay, so an introduction to EAA, which stands for Electronically Assisted Astronomy. And what really is it? And people may have heard of it, some people may not have heard of it. And I'll try and explain that by talking about some of the history around EAA or video astronomy. And the earliest reference I can find is this really cool article that was published by the Lick Observatory back in 1928. And it talks about this amazing new technology of television. And in this little article, we see that they're connecting the telescopes from an observatory and basically pushing out the images, transmitting the images to the public, to certain educational institutions, etc. But basically broadcasting the views of the telescope, which I find really cool to think that back then they were even talking about this sort of stuff. The next reference I can find is here, a gentleman from the Sydney Amateur Astronomers, and he's using video astronomy. He's very relaxed. I really love his choice of attire for an observing session, which you can see he's got his telescope on what looks to be an equatorial mount. He's got some sort of rig there connected to the telescope and watching on a very slimlined television. So as we continue, in the mid 90s, a lot of amateurs began to experiment with webcams, things like the QuickCam or the Philips 2Cam, as well as some inexpensive CCD security surveillance cameras. Specifically, one that folks might remember is something called the Super Circuits PC23C. And it was predominantly only good for solar system objects. And what we mean by that is very bright objects. But then in the late 1990s, we had manufacturers come out, folks like Stellacam and Malacam, with definitely more sensitive chips, but these were very, very small chips. So you only saw a very small portion of the sky. In the 2000s, innovation kept coming. We started to see some cameras that had color. We saw some enhancements to the circuitry that allowed it to be a little bit more sensitive, and we saw cooling to reduce some of the noise, the electronic noise in some of these cameras. By the mid to late 2000s, a lot of amateurs began experimenting again with much more sensitive security surveillance cameras. Very, very popular ones were the LN300 and some of these Samsung models. But we're now at a point that we've got larger chips, much better read noise, and we're able to control those cameras through USB. Additionally, the software has come just an amazing amount of change in the last decade. We've got much clearer views. We're able to do longer exposures, much more in terms of real-time enhancements, etc. So what is EAA? What is it? Is it visual? Is it observing an object? Are you taking an astrophoto of it? Where does it fall? And I like to think that it's falling right in between. It's neither, but it's also both. There are very many similarities across the two, across all the different options. And you'll get, if you ask 10 astronomers or 10 people that do EAA, you're going to get 11 different opinions. But here's what I think. And definitely something that developed out of video astronomy. It's about observing the object as close to possible as real time. And it's not about collecting data for later processing. Instead of using an eyepiece, you're using the sensitivity of a camera to enhance your view of an object. And again, it's all about doing it now and not later to make a pretty picture out of it. It's about exploiting the technology either inside the camera, which oftentimes is referred to integration, a night vision device, which unfortunately I'm not going to talk about in this presentation because I don't have the experience, or using technology within a computer. We often refer to that as live stacking. And again, it's about enhancing your view of the object now. Most purists are going to agree that if you do any sort of post-processing, it's not EAA, it's imaging. And if you're ever on cloudy nights, there is a forum for EAA, and it's been quite an evolving subject with many different opinions. So why would you want to do EAA? What are the benefits of doing this? And I think for me, one of the biggest ones is really increasing your light grasp. So in this scenario, I'm showing a sketch from a gentleman in West Virginia, very dark skies, and he's using a 14-inch SCT. You can see what he was able to see through his telescope of the Ring Nebula M57. Now, in this next view, I took this screenshot. It was 20 seconds. This was from Big Woods, and I took it through an 11-inch SCT. Now, I tried to find the dimmest object in both of these views in his sketch and my capture. So if you look at his sketch, there was this star, which is an apparent magnitude of 15.3. Yet, if we look on the EAA view, we're looking at an object that has a magnitude of 18.45. So you are absolutely getting a much deeper view into the night sky doing EAA, and with a smaller telescope. But we can also overcome light pollution. And this is a screen grab that was taken from Greater London by a gentleman by the name of Maurice Gavin. And he is in zone 4, which is very bright. That's about as bright as downtown Raleigh. And this is what he was able to accomplish with a 12-inch SCT at about 100 seconds. So to be able to grab something like this from a downtown urban environment is quite impressive. And it's a great outreach tool. We've got a couple pictures here of ways that you can start to share um, what you're viewing with others. In a few cases, we've got a projector shining down on the ground. I love the very first picture in the top um, left-hand side where they're showing a view of the moon. And the club did purchase a, what do you call it? Now I can't even think straight, sorry. The club did purchase a projector to do
LCD
something
projector.
like this. Thank you. And I can't wait to get started to do it once we can do a few more outreach events. But to be able to show the moon on the ground and have the kids come over and you can say, hey, come and jump on the moon. I'm sure it's going to be a big hit. But again, you've got another example of the Orion Nebula being shared. Then the pictures on the right-hand side, we took from a statewide Star Party event several years ago. And this was a case of sharing views from my telescope. And that in that top picture, you can see that is the Great Herculean Globular Cluster. So it's a great way to share and to be part of outreach experiences. In fact, we did this last week with the outreach event on top of the Willard at the hotel. So there are definitely some other reasons, and it basically allows people to enjoy astronomy who have either vision difficulties, any one of us that might be dealing with aging eyes. Young children oftentimes have difficulty looking through an eyepiece. You get to enjoy an image in color rather than shades of gray. We're allowed to do internet broadcasts with this, virtual star parties. We've done a few of these as a club in the past. You can actually, it's technology that's very easy to be adapted for remote control and viewing. So you can set up your scope outside in the cold and dial into your computer that's by the telescope through another computer and do some observing from inside where it's nice and warm. It definitely captures photons much more effectively than our own human eye does. So you can actually see very deep sky objects with much smaller scopes. So you don't necessarily have to succumb to as much aperture fever if you want to do visual or strictly visual work. And it also allows viewing of dozens of objects in an evening, versus if you were truly doing astrophotography, you're spending most of the evening capturing data for only a few objects, maybe even only one. And it allows for socially distant astronomy. So imagine that. There are some drawbacks. It's definitely not a perfect solution. And depending on the setup, it can be much more difficult to set up, operate, and take down. You're going to have more cables. You've got to deal with the monitor. You've got extra equipment. Obviously, the use of a projector or a monitor, laptop screens, they're going to produce some very problematic stray light. So you have to make sure you're practicing good astro neighbor behavior. A lot more can go wrong when you've got cables and computers and everything than just with viewing through an eyepiece. And I'd say there can be a rather steep learning curve, especially with some of the supporting software. I'd say that it takes several nights of true die-hard experimentation, kind of doing one thing at a time. By the way, a star party is a great place to kind of experiment with this. But it definitely, it takes time. It's not easy to just jump in and start seeing results. So, but it's important to set some realistic expectations on what you can do with the EAA. So it does increase your light grasp. I've heard anything from 3 times to 6 times. It's going to be great on dim objects like galaxy, nebula, globular clusters. You're not going to get that beautiful shimmer when you're looking at open clusters that you do in the eyepiece. And you just cannot compete with the dynamic range of the human eye. So If you want to do this on planets, it's going to be very hard to get the exposure set. Let's say if you're looking at Saturn, you want to see the details on Saturn, but you also want to see the fact that you can see the Galilean moons. You can't do that with an EAA camera. You really need the human eye to do that. And you're not going to get photographic quality in terms of your captures for only tens of seconds or maybe even just a few minutes of gathering exposures, and of course, no processing. So for example, this is a screenshot I took. This was with my very first camera, and it was a older analog kind of enhanced security camera. That's 20 seconds, and this is of M51, the Whirlpool Galaxy. So not bad for 20 seconds. Definitely a lot more than I could ever see with my 11-inch visually. Now with my newer camera, this is about 5 minutes of exposure. I can really see a whole lot more. I can see more color. I can see much more detail within the dust lanes of the spiral galaxy. Just in general, it's a much nicer view. But then compare that to 75 minutes of exposure with, again, these are all C11s, but in this case, we're capturing 75 minutes of data and post-processing. So again, it's not going to be the same. So if it's something that you are interested in, what equipment are you going to need? So we'll talk about some of just the basics. So this was more the traditional view. So this is the, kind of, we'll call it the easy video astronomy. So you've got a scope. It is a go-to telescope. We've got the camera. Whoops, go back. We've got the camera there, and you'll see that there's a separate 12-volt power component to it. So you have to be powered from a different source. And then you've got a lead going to the monitor. And of course, in this scenario, you're having to manipulate the camera by pushing buttons on the back of the camera to change exposures and things like that. So then we can actually go to maybe the next stage. Same telescope, same analog camera, but in this case, we're no longer using the television, we're using a computer. And in this case, we've got to change the analog out from the camera using a video grabber and changing it back into a digital format. And now the computer can take those images and start to improve or make real-time changes in the images so we can see it a little bit clearer, a little bit better. And then we have now just kind of a complete computer piece with a more modern camera. And so you only have one cable. The camera itself gets power from a USB from the computer, and the computer can control the camera as well as do all the capturing and processing of data. Now, mentioned cameras. I would say start with what you have. If you've got a smartphone, I would highly recommend purchasing an adapter like the one shown here. That's a Celestron NEXYZ. Yep, that's it. And these just clamp around the eyepiece, and you can get some really, really great results on bright objects. If you have a DSLR, many DSLRs have a video mode, and there are certain pieces of software that enable you to do something called live stacking of DSLR images. And we'll talk about live stacking a little bit later. Or you can go with a dedicated astronomy camera. And this is going to allow folks to vary and enhance the output. So you can really change up your integration or exposure time and pretty much play with all the different components of the exposure, whether it's color balance, gain, gamma. You can even change some of the histogram curves. Now, for me, I would recommend if you're just starting out or you're unsure, go with a cheap, simple CCD camera solution. This one here is called the Revolution 2. You don't need a computer, and it's kind of a turnkey package. You can get one with a DVR that will capture your images if you want them. It even comes with its own little monitor and a handheld remote that you can control the camera wirelessly instead of having to push buttons on the push buttons on the back of the camera. But it is low resolution, so or standard resolution. So you're looking at about 640 pixels by 480 pixels. And I'll show you some of the examples later on of what these kind of standard or lower resolution cameras look like. But if you want higher quality pictures, CMOS chips are the way to go. You do need a computer or a tablet or something, and you're going to need software that will control the camera as well as the software. You do get higher resolution pictures, but you have to do longer exposures. So the CCDs are much more sensitive, but again, they have their drawbacks. So if you want those really, really beautiful pictures, you no longer can do it in seconds. You've got to do it in more along the lines of minutes. They have great read noise, and my preference is to get a cooled camera, again, just to kind of keep as much of that electronic noise down as possible. Now, whatever you wind up getting, make sure you do your research and try to match your telescope and optical train with your camera. In certain cases, the components or the type of chip that a camera has really is meant for a certain focal length telescope. So again, do your research and try and make sure you get within that range. So as far as telescopes, just about any telescope will do, just as long as it can reach focus with a camera. When you are thinking about a telescope, make sure that your scope and your focuser can take the weight of the camera and other gear, whether you're going to put on some filters or focal reducers. What you don't want to have happen is as you tilt your scope up, that it has too much weight and then the focuser slides down and you've just lost all the work in trying to set up your focus. So it needs to make sure that you can somehow either lock your focus or make sure that doesn't slip. Aperture is much less important in EAA than focal ratio. So the shorter the focal ratio, the more of the sky you're going to see for a given camera and the faster you're going to be able to acquire images. Just like astrophotography, shorter focal length, faster the scope. EAA cameras tend to favor smaller sensors, and the combination of a long focal length scope plus a very small sensor will basically equate to a very small field of view. So think about getting a good focal reducer. Schmidt-Cassegrains do very well with hyperstars. They can be expensive and they can be a bit fiddly. You've got to get your collimation and your focus just right with these. So it does take a fair amount of experimentation to get it dialed in. And the larger the aperture, you'd think, oh, okay, we'll get more light. But the larger the aperture, the more susceptible the scope is going to be to light pollution, moon glow, and atmospheric disturbances. So you don't want to oftentimes go too big. In terms of mounts, want to make sure that we're, because I'll talk about it in this section, we're going to make sure we understand the difference between a single capture versus the total exposure time. So in other words, a single capture is, again, what you would think of as just one snapshot, one picture, and then when you add those together, that's your total exposure time. So a lot's going to depend on what mount you need, depending upon what objects you're trying to view, how bright or dim that particular object is. So if you're going to be doing captures under 15 seconds, so that is you're going after brighter objects, or you've got a bigger scope, or your camera is much more sensitive, then pretty much any alt-azimuth mount that has tracking will do. So you can see it towards the bottom is SCT, and it's just alt-az. We also have a Dobsonian there, it's alt-az. It can do it. In fact, there's software that can help you combat the rotation that you'll see in the image. But for captures over 15 seconds, those alt-az scopes are going to show rotation, and you're going to get your stars towards the edge of the field of view or start to get oblonged, and it's not going to look good. So if you're planning on doing anything over 15 seconds, an equatorial mount or a some sort of wedge, if you have a SCT, is going to be needed. But even for the brighter objects, you can even do it with a manual Dob, but results will be limited. When I first started, I borrowed another member's camera, and I was able to get the Ring Nebula through a 6-inch manual Dob, and definitely could see it. Couldn't do any of the real-time enhancements or other things, but again, I could still get the Ring Nebula. Now, there are several software packages today that can help against tracking errors, adjust for those things, and field rotation. So software is very, very important when you're doing EAA. And I just want to illustrate the difference here when you're looking at an alt-azimount versus an equatorial. And in the graphic below, you'll see as an object passes across the sky, your view through the telescope is going to rotate. So, in this case, we're simulating a view of the moon. You can see as we go across, that moon is going to continue to rotate in your field of view as the camera makes those stepped adjustments. But when you're looking at through an equatorial mount, as the object goes through the sky, the orientation of the view stays the same. And that's why, again, you want to make sure you've got the mount, the correct mount for what you want to achieve. I mentioned focal reducers. Here are some examples. We've got the standard SCT focal reducer. There are quite a few out there that I think Antares, GSO, several others make a 1.25" 0.5 focal reducer. I've got one, and it works for small sensors or small chips in cameras. There's a Hyperstar there. Again, if you've got an SCT, you can put that on the front of your corrector plate and do all the connections. And I've even seen variable options where you can use spacers and things like that to help stack or change some of the focal reduction. I've even experimented and put 2 of the 0.63 focal reducers, kind of stack them together. And I was shocked to get down to about f 3.7, 3.8 with that. Lots of distortion towards the edges, but it was something that is possible. You're also going to need a laptop, a monitor, some sort of device to actually see what the camera is capturing. In the very first picture, we see this is the Revolution 2, and it just has a very, very small monitor connected right there. Next picture, you can see someone's got a slightly bigger monitor that's slapped onto the top of their scope, so on and so on. So we've got other examples, computers and television monitors. Got an example here of an orange SCT Celestron, and the gentleman has a cart that he just wheels out, and that becomes his table. You can even see you can connect your laptop right next to your Dob. And the last picture is from a gentleman down in Australia who does a lot of virtual broadcasts, and you can see he's got his a microphone that he uses as he's doing his internet broadcasts, and he can control his mount and do everything. So he's got his own little work station there. We talked about video grabbers. So if you've got a one of the more the analog cameras out there, one of the security cameras, you can definitely employ these. In fact, that's what you're going to need to do if you want to capture the images on a computer. And so it does convert that analog signal out to digital. And there are tons and tons of options out there. But what I noticed, at least when I did it, I got some very weird random hot pixels, and they weren't always the same and always in the same place, but they would just kind of pop in, pop out. And I believe that to be anomalies that are created because you're going from, obviously, it's a chip, so it's receiving in digital, transferring it to analog out of the camera, and then you're converting it back to digital. So it's going digital, analog, digital. So again, it works, and if the little hot pixels don't bother you, it's a great way to start. In terms of software, here are the more popular ones. So Milo Stick, this only works for the Cam cameras, but the people that have the Cams swear by this software. Infinity software is also another fantastic option. It's used with some of the ATIC cameras. I've seen it in operation, and it is pretty impressive. And folks that have the ATIC cameras love this software. Lodestar Live, something if you've got a Starlight Express camera. Again, I've heard only great things about it. SharpCap, this is my preference. It's very popular. Some versions are free. I've been using SharpCap since I think they started out with version 3. They've gone through actually I take that back, version 2.8. So I've done 2.8 all the way through several versions of 3, and now they're on version 4. And I'm very impressed with how often the author is providing updates. I think now I'm up, might be up to $15 a year for the software, but it is absolutely fantastic. And then there's another one called Astro Toaster. And if you've got a DSLR camera and want to do this kind of live stacking or EAA, I hear they have a great option for DSLR cameras. And of course, with astronomy, it's never just about having a telescope and some eyepieces. You got to get all the other accessories and so forth. We talked earlier about being a good astro neighbor and keeping your the light pollution down. So you do want to make sure you've got some ability to control that. Oftentimes we'll refer to that as the control room. So for your laptop and monitor, you might think about some sort of tent or a shield for that. I've seen people with again small RV tents. The picture in the bottom right-hand corner is actually one of these setups, and the tent that's being used is actually a one made for kind of boondocking when you're camping. It's supposed to be kind of a shower and a place to have the potty and everything. So you can stand in it, but it's just big enough to be able to have your little table and kind of be your tiny control room. I love the picture off to the top right, where a gentleman has his large teardrop camper, and he's got his whole setup. He actually has light panels or kind of fabric that he'll then set up around that back hatch, and it kind of basically keeps everything from, keeps all the light inside there. Other accessories, you definitely want to think about a focus mask. Helps get your focus dialed in just right. Automated focusers are a huge lifesaver. It can be very difficult when you've got your screen in one place and you're kind of walking back and forth between your focuser and your screen to see if it achieved the right focus. An automated focuser controlled by a computer, and you can sit there and change the focus and see those results immediately on your screen. And of course, you're going to need a way to power all of your stuff. So figure out a way to get either very, very long extension cord or a battery box or something along those lines. And this is an example. This was my setup this last October at Staunton River Star Party. So I have an ice fishing shelter, and that just besides being something that the makers of this particular product must have been thinking, what kind of crazy guy is buying an ice fishing shelter for North Carolina? Well, it is completely light proof, and it's fantastic. You cannot see, I can have that thing lit up like Las Vegas inside, and you cannot see any light coming out. Plus, if it gets cold, it helps kind of keep me warm. We have my main telescope for EAA. that is my battery box. I've got it in a large toolbox. It's a 100 amp hour AGM battery. I also have a solar scope for daytime use, and I have a refractor that also provides me a much wider field of view. And when you're doing this late at night, you need an outdoor kitchen with a coffee maker. And I'm getting too old. I don't sleep on the ground anymore when I camp, so I need a little home away from home. So in terms of actually doing EAA, I'm going to oversimplify the process, but it is pretty straightforward. And the perfect solution for EAA. So this is, this is it. This, if anyone ever asks you, this is how to do EAA. And the perfect solution is there is no honest perfect solution. There is no best way. Everything is going to be a compromise. And those things are going to change depending upon what your goals are. So no solution is better than another. You've got to determine what is going to work best for you and with your goals. And of course, things are going to change. So your goal, now is going to be very different from maybe what you want to do in 5 years or so. And at that point, your equipment will have to adapt to that, or you're going to have to change out your equipment. So, if someone's seriously considering doing EAA, don't get stuck thinking too much about what do I need now, and then something I could absolutely kind of continue to progress and build on, because oftentimes that is very difficult to do. So, focus on what you need now, what you think you're going to be able to do in the short term, and then just be ready or know that you have to adapt or maybe even switch out equipment. But accomplishing EAA can be summed up in two pretty simple steps. And that is, the first is to capture an exposure. So again, the goal of EAA is to get that view of that object that's going to be brighter and more colorful and more detailed than what we can see through that same telescope just using an eyepiece. So again, if we think back to the example shared earlier of the Ring Nebula, again, we want color, we want you can see more detailed. And by the way, this is a picture of using a one of those standard or kind of low resolution CCD cameras. Now, of course, this is all accomplished with an aided by camera instead of an eyepiece. And the exposure is the amount of time we're allowing the camera to collect that light. Of course, the longer the exposure, the more light is going to be captured, and therefore the brighter an object and the more detail we're going to see. The problem comes in is that with longer exposures, we are susceptible to electronic noise coming from the camera. We could have limitations with our tracking, or if you have an Alt-Az, you can maybe limited in what you can do. And you're going to get other objects interfering with your exposure. You might get a chain of satellites going through your view. Now, so it's all about finding that balance of exposures, something long enough to capture details, but not too long as to introduce those particular problems. So we have got an ace up our sleeves, and that is called live stacking. So when we do that, or let me explain what live stacking is, and it really is what it sounds like. So the camera is just going to take individual exposures one by one by one, and it's going to start adding all of those pixels right on top of each other. So it's going to take the whole field of view, your 3000 by 3000 pixels or whatever size resolution your camera is, and it's just going to add the data, the brightness of 1 pixel on this frame, then plus the data or brightness from another frame. It's just to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. So you can think about it like a stack of 6 10-second exposures is kind of like a 1 60-second exposure. Now that's not it's not exactly correct. They're not equal. This is just kind of thinking about that, because a 60-second exposure does have more information and is better than just 6-10 seconds. But again, you can think of it that way. So once it's done with those those exposures, it then combines it all, and now you have a picture that is more detailed than any of the single 10-second exposures that you had before. So live stacking is the way to go, or stacking exposures. So I'm categorizing these in two very broad buckets. When you do the stacking or combining inside the camera, that's often called integration or hardware stacking. And then when you do that via software on the computer or outside of the camera, we often refer to that as just stacking or software stacking. And these are some of my examples. So the first ones are all from a CCD camera. So this is going to be standard resolution, low resolution. And these are all probably, none of these are going to be over 20 seconds long. But you can see we've got some nebula, we've got a galaxy, we've got an open cluster. But you do have kind of some blocky stars, and it's a little bit hard to see, but in some of them you'll see some very bright green and red little dots. That's the weird hot pixels that I was talking about.
Mike, we had a question
Yeah.
on the and there. Can you use your iPad as a projection method?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Depends on the software and what you're doing, but yes, you can. Then we'll jump to my, so this was my first CMOS camera, called a 385. Now you're getting much larger resolution. And this is a case where now you have to extend your exposures. You can't do it now in just seconds. Again, all those other ones were less than 20 seconds. Now the majority of these are going to be between 3 to maybe 6 seconds long. And so this is one of the Eagle Nebula. Here we have the Ring Nebula, the Dumbbell Nebula. Again, I tried to get some of the same ones as from previously. We've got the Sculptor Galaxy. Pay no attention to the little dust bunny that's in the bottom right-hand corner. And now we're getting to now my latest camera is called the ASI 533. And I upgraded to this one because it had something called a deeper well depth for each of the pixels. And what it wound up doing is enable me to get a bit more contrast between the colors. So I'm finding that I'm able to get much darker backgrounds and kind of much brighter nebula with it. So again, it's got a little bit more range of a camera. So here's the Whirlpool. This is the Orion Nebula. And again, none of these are more than 5 or 6 minutes long. We've got M81 and M82. These are very, very close to each other. Unfortunately, my setup doesn't allow me to fit them both into a single picture. So I've got them split out here. And this is actually one of a recent one that's turned out to be one of my favorites because we do have some distant galaxies, but down below here, this little pocket, I didn't even know I was in the field of view until I started playing around with the enhancements. Again, real time, something called Hickson 56. So these are 5 galaxies. All of them are in the neighborhood of 4 to 500 million light years from us. So that just blew me away. I was only going for one of these galaxies, looking at it for my Herschel 400 observing, but to then catch another galaxy pretty close, and then this Hickson 56 in the same field of view was just that was a great observing moment. And then here's the Eagle Nebula. I did not have the correct dark settings set up with my software, so I've got a hot pixel that's jumping around. And here's the horse head. And last but not least, there are much simpler options. This is something I did with my 4-inch refractor. On a manual Alt-Az mount, you can see as this thing is shaking. Here I am zooming in on the moon, just kind of pinching the the view on my iPhone 7 at the time, and you can definitely see when I start to really kind of turn the knobs on the mount, right? You start to get a lot of jumping. But this is using the NEXYZ cell phone adapter, and it's just a really good way to start. So any kind of bright object. So again, you can pretty much do EAAs, and this is again just a good lunar example that I have. So with that, if we've got any questions.
I have a question.
Yep.
If you could go back to the last slide that you had with the cell phone adapters.
Yep.
Because I have a cell phone adapter, and I guess my problem is that it keeps moving around. So really, what you're supposed to do is have your eyepiece straight up, like the way you have it, and then that works so that your cell phone adapter does not start. I don't know. It would move on me, and
Yep.
so
Yep.
okay.
So I
knew
would,
there was a trick. I knew
yeah,
there was a trick somewhere.
I highly recommend this unit. And the reason is because, again, it's kind of in the name, but you see the X, Y, and Z. There are actually
Right.
very small control knobs kind of on the back of the unit. You can't really see it here, but it allows you to, with very small increments and with a fair amount of precision, it allows you to slide your camera right and left, up and down, and then also closer and further away from the eyepiece. So you can actually get it dialed in just right for kind of because every cell phone is going to be different. Every time you clamp on one of these adapters onto your eyepiece, it's going to wind up being different. So you're always going to have to manually adjust. And a lot of the ones that you just kind of lock in with thumb screws or something, you're never the tolerances are just too large that it's so hard to get that cell phone dialed in just right. And that's the key. It really needs to be set up. There's a very small sweet spot, if you will, over the eyepiece where your cell phone needs to be. So that's why I highly recommend it. This one isn't perfect. There's a little bit of slop in some of it. I noticed that mine kind of just has a slight, kind of hangs down just a little bit. But I was able to there are some adjustments, and I was able to get it to that it does work. But I think it's, I've had two others before this, and this one to me has been the best one. Any other questions?
Hey, Mike, I thought I'd just interject here. It does take some practice using the XYZ, as Mike can attest to. There's a couple of things you can do to help give yourself some early easy results. First of all, choose an object like the moon that's easy to find. It's really forgiving. So don't try to go for an open cluster or something like that. Try to go for the moon. The other thing you can do is if your main eyepiece, let's say, is a 25 millimeter Plössl, you could also buy a second 25 millimeter Plössl and get and just dedicate that to your iPhone. So, or to your whatever your cell phone is, dedicate that to the XYZ, and then you can, when you got your object in your scope, you can just pull your 25 millimeter Plössl out, plop the XYZ with the 25 millimeter Plössl in, and you're there. You're maybe just a couple of turns and you'd be in focus. The other thing you can do, and Mike actually has it pictured right here in the center of the screen, is put your cell phone in and then crank the cell phone down to where you can actually look through the eyepiece, make sure you're centered, and then you just twist it back up. And then all you have to do is maybe just side to side a little bit, and your object will be in there. And those are some of the things that can take some of the initial frustration out of actually using the XYZ when you first get
it. And no, you may have to change focus. So
yes.
Even though you might have it perfectly centered and everything, you might have to change the focus on it.
Yeah. Just practice with it. Give it some patience, and you'll be an old hat at it in no time flat.
Okay. So everything I'm sharing here, these are all just snapshots from my screen. I mean, it's a, the result of these are all just a single JPEG image. This is exactly what I saw on my computer screen. There's no difference. I didn't touch up anything, except for I may have cropped something, to get it in the right view. So these images, these pictures I'm showing, are literally what you're going to see on your computer screen, or monitor or whatever. So it is something that, and I'm certainly not trying to discourage anyone from astrophotography, because I truly feel that is an art form, and you do put a lot of your own kind of touches on it. You're making the image that you want to see based with all the data that you've gathered. But it is a process. This is much less of a process. It's literally just kind of enhancing what you can see right now. So again, I just wanted to underscore, none of this has been processed. This is all as seen on a computer screen. Any other questions?
Mike, I've read a few things about the pros and cons of a CCD chip versus a CMOS chip. Have you noticed any differences as you've evolved your equipment?
Yes, and I'm certainly not an expert on it, but what I can say is, compared to a CCD chip compared to a CMOS chip, I will say the CCDs are more sensitive. In other words, they're able to collect light and information a whole lot faster. However, they tend to be much lower resolution, and I think they're noisier. In other words, you get a lot of inherent, what's the word? Just kind of, you'll see digital noise and things like that in them. Again, that was my experience with my camera. Yes.
Yeah, so I've got a CCD, a QHY10 CCD, along with the ZWA ASI cameras, the CMOS. The CCD has higher read noise, so it's not suitable for 15 or 30-second exposures. I run mine like a 5-minute exposure, and then you have much more signal to noise ratio. The advantage is with the CCD, when I do 5-minute exposures, I don't need any darks. I mean, I don't do any darks. It's that clean in terms of the signal once you get enough signal on the chip.
Okay. Yeah, so depending upon what you're doing with, if you're doing EAA, which tends to be much smaller captures, yeah, I think
a CCD isn't suitable. A CCD is not suitable for EAA.
Yeah,
in my opinion.
But the CMOS is, at least what I found, it's been great. You do need to expose a little bit longer. There are times where I miss being able to get everything I wanted to in less than 20 seconds. But at the same time, I'm much more willing to wait, so I can get higher resolution.
Hey, so Mike, I may have missed this in your talk. Did you talk about taking darks and flats?
I did not. Didn't. So there are ways that, and those are part of the enhancements. A dark basically, it almost is what you're talking about. You're taking you're exposing your camera with an opaque cover on front of it. So anything that's triggering or anything that's causing the sensors to get excited is going to be just read noise or hot pixels and that sort of thing. So you can use those darks, if you will, as a library, and many of the software packages will then subtract what those darks are from your actual image. So you kind of start reducing your noise. So for example, if I had the correct dark set up in this example here, you can see that kind of green squiggly line just to the left of the Eagle Nebula. That was a hot pixel. I was using my dark library or darks that I'd taken with my 385 on this camera, and it didn't pick up a straight pixel. So that would have been removed using darks. And again, it's real time. It's just it's literally subtracting it as the live stacking is happening.
Mike, EAA with a DSLR versus the dedicated like ASI type cameras. Intuitively, I would think that the DSLR might be a way to go in the beginning, because I could use the DSLR for everyday use, right? When I go on vacations. But have you had much experience with using the DSLR with your equipment?
I have not. I've never used a DSLR. I don't own one. So what I can say is they do tend to be heavier than a regular astronomy camera. And that's another battery you need to contend with. So something to consider. But if you have a DSLR and you want to do this, I would say absolutely start with the DSLR first, see if it's something that you enjoy. And then, if you want to do it more, then you can consider, one of the CMOS cameras. The other thing to think about there is the software. Now, that SharpCap software that I was referencing, it does have the ability to monitor a folder. So in other words, if your DSLR is just taking picture after picture after picture through your telescope, it can send those files to a particular folder on your PC or whatever you're using. Actually, if you're using SharpCap, you have to use a PC. But it can send it to a certain folder, and then SharpCap can then monitor that folder. And so instead of capturing data and it being directly connected to the camera, SharpCap that is, it's going to monitor the folder instead. So you can still do real-time enhancements every time a new picture or a new image is then put onto into that folder space. So you can do it that way. I've never used AstroToaster, but AstroToaster may be able to do it in a slightly different way. But I would absolutely say if you've got a DSLR, before going out and purchasing a dedicated astronomy camera, I'd say go the DSLR route. Plus, you're going to get, most DSLRs are going to have a much larger sensor than my 533, definitely in some of my earlier cameras. So you're going to get a much wider view. You may not have to resort to a focal reducer, but again, I've never used it, so can't totally 100% comment on it. Any other questions?
There are a couple in chat that haven't been asked. Phyllis was asking about the exposure for the Hickson 56. Do you know what the exposure was to capture that?
Yes, so that was, I know I did 15 seconds on that. And again, I almost never go over 5 to 6 minutes. I just, at that point, there's there's a diminishing return. So yeah, 15 seconds running through my 11-inch at, and I was running it at, what do you call it, about f3.7. And that was the Hickson.
There's also a question about the Bortle scale. Were all these pictures taken in basically the same light conditions?
Yes. So I would say most of the ones that I just shared were either at least with the higher res cameras, were all taken from Staunton River. So you're looking at what is that, Bortle 4, Bortle 3?
Yeah,
I think. Yeah. I'd say many of these, many of the AVS ones were done probably at Big Woods. I will tell you, I had my EAA set up at, again, the Willard. So that was our public outreach event in downtown Raleigh. And I had never done it with this, with that camera set up from downtown Raleigh. I set it up first at a, just again, I think my camera was set for 15 seconds and I got nothing but white. So from downtown Raleigh, just pointing it up at the sky, I got it completely overexposed. I realized that I had to be down between 2.5 seconds to, I was pushing it at 5 seconds. So I kept it down to 2.5 seconds. So, and there was still a fair amount of light pollution coming through. So it, everything is going to, you have to basically adapt to the conditions. That said, I think I've gotten some really good results back when I was with my 385 and when we were doing some of our virtual star party or virtual RAC ops, and we were kind of sharing that. And that was skies in apex. So, again, nothing beats a dark sky. Doesn't matter what what technology you're using. Dark skies are always better, but it's something you can accomplish in definitely more light polluted areas. Let's see. Let's go back to chat here. Yep, the Revolution 2. Sorry, my mouse is taking the vacation. What is the estimated cost? Okay, so I think we talked about that. And dome, bortle scale. Are you familiar with the unistellar scopes? That seems like an easy way to do EAA. Kind of expensive though. A friend in this meeting recently bought one. If you don't like it, don't disparage it too much. I have not seen much of the unistellar scopes. So I haven't seen the output of one, me personally. I do think they're expensive, but what it does provide you with is a complete turnkey system. The scope, the alignment, everything all in one. So I would say to someone that's new and wants to use this technology and doesn't have a lot of experience setting up telescopes, it is a fantastic way to go. I will say though, if you are an experienced amateur and you know how to set up scopes and do your alignments and that sort of thing, it is it's very expensive. You can get I would say you can get a more powerful telescope. You can probably get a better camera for the same amount of money, but you have to piece it all together. And it's going to be, so if you don't have that experience, it's definitely worth paying for someone to have already kind of built that and put it into one piece. But again, I have not seen the results me personally, but I know a few members have it. So it's pretty cool.
Let me, I'll interject because I know, and we actually have a few, like you said, we have a few club members that actually have the Interstellar. Yeah, it's an excellent scope. You can, if literally, as Mike said, it's turnkey. You just set it down, turn on the switch, and it uses plate solving like a lot of the astrophotographers use in the club, and many others to actually figure out where it's at, and then it begins taking pictures basically from that you select. It does will go ahead and do auto stacking for you, so it auto stacks the frame and everything. And so it's an excellent scope, and it depends on the kind of science you want to do, because some of the unistellar folks have gotten together in other countries, and so if you think of someone in France and someone in America, they can actually sync the two scopes together, and they can actually perform quite a bit of interferometry, which we can't do. Even with our nice scopes like we have them easily. So it kind of does that automatically for you. So the Unistellar, as Mike said, you're going to lay down probably about $2 grand for the $2 or $3 grand for the Unistellar 1, and then for the Unistellar 2 is going to be somewhere around $5 grand, I believe, especially also to the back if you buy the backpack. But again, all that stuff's in one package. You don't have to do any of the figuring out or anything like that. And you also have to realize you're not going to be switching out eyepieces either, because it's one lone eyepiece itself. You're actually looking at a small CCD screen actually in the scope. But yeah, I mean, I think they're excellent scopes if you want to get into it.
Yeah, I think it should be said. You're right, and it's a dedicated scope. You're not going to be able to do any visual. I've been asked many times how much I probably have invested in my scope. I'd say maybe 3,000 to 3,500 when I think about kind of just the camera now and what I've got. And that's an 11-inch telescope, so I can do visual. I can do EAA if I really wanted to do astrophotography. I'm sure I could, do that as well. But I would say it is not something for a beginner to try and take just your standard 11-inch telescope and see about adding all this stuff on. So I think it just depends on where you are in the hobby. And I'll comment on the last question first. Any comments on EV scope versus Stellina? And I would say I don't know enough about them to make an informed comment. I don't know if Doug or anybody else.
Yeah, those are the same. They're the same. They're the same as the Unistellar, the same type of concept.
Yeah.
I would say I think the Unistellar is more portable than the Stellina, personally, and it's the same scope just about. So, yeah.
Yep. Okay. So Bob, you asked about what software would work with a Dobsonian telescope. I guess the question I would have is it a tracking telescope or not? Really any one of those software packages would work. A lot's going to depend on your camera more than anything. But if you've got just a regular Dobsonian without any tracking, you can still use SharpCap. So that's going to allow you to do a multitude of different cameras. But what you won't be able to do is you won't be able to do what we call live stacking. So that's kind of one on top of another on top of another. You'd almost have to have it in video mode or be taking, short exposures because you're going to have to be manually moving it around. So you could definitely try. I still think that SharpCap has a free version of it, and it doesn't have all the bells and whistles. But again, if you were manually tracking a Dob, you wouldn't be able to take advantage of those anyway. So the free version would be more than fine. Any other questions? Okay, then. Well, I want to thank everybody for the questions, and hopefully gave folks just an idea of what is possible with this EAA technology. And again, thank you for tuning in.